Hello and welcome. A warm welcome to Frost Over the World. Later in the programme, is the Euro doomed? Is the Arab Spring perhaps being hijacked? And we take a look, among other things, at French movies as well. But we begin with Pakistan, where President Zardari is facing a huge range of problems, including corruption allegations. But in many ways, it's all oddly familiar. When I last spoke to him at any length, he was just 7 months into his presidency. I spoke to him about the problems he faced then, the economy, his own popularity, pressure from the army, and indeed pressure from Pervez Musharraf as well. It was a case of deja vu all over again. A few weeks ago, I spoke to former President Musharraf, and he said at one point, as you may have read in the interview, he said that if there was anything that he could do in the future to help, he would be willing to contribute in some way to the future of Pakistan. Could you ever conceive of there being such a situation?
I think the people of Pakistan are the best judge of that. And if you think so, you should join and make a political party and come in the arena and see, because it's not the question of to be called upon to help because you're a technocrat or you're a bureaucrat or you're an intellect. All three he's obviously not. If he wants to, then he has to come in the political field and be elected.
Do you think you can serve your full term?
I think that the world today doesn't have an appetite for another dictator. So therefore this democracy will flourish and go on and complete its term, and hopefully democracy is what has delivered in the world everywhere else, and it just needs the strength to be able to deliver.
Another quote, somebody said, most countries have an army. In Pakistan, the army has a country. I mean, because of the power of the army. Do you have any fears about the power of the army today, or do you think the army has made an epoch-making decision that no longer will it involve in politics?
I think the circumstances are such that everybody's come to realize that this war cannot be won without the political ownership. So the army knows that they have hurt themselves in the past by being allowed to be used politically, and they've come to a conscious decision of responsible decision of staying just the army. And to answer your first question, it is a very large institution. To say that it will not have a bearing on the thinking of Pakistan politics would be a wrong statement, because it is the fourth largest army and it is the regional, very large force, and one has to take its position and take it along to most decisions which concern them.
Well, there, President Zardari in our last conversation. Well, now in extraordinary scenes this week, the Pakistan Prime Minister, Raza Gilani, was made to appear in court to face contempt proceedings, which could see him barred from public office. The Supreme Court has ordered him to reopen corruption proceedings against President Zardari. But Mr. Gilani claims the president is immune from the charges. Some believe the Supreme Court is in cahoots with the army and wants to see both the president and the prime minister overthrown. Joining me now from Washington is Akbar Ahmed, the former Pakistan ambassador to the UK, now a professor of Islamic studies at the American University, and he has been called the world's leading authority on contemporary Islam. Well, congratulations on that nomenclature. It's very good to see you, Akbar. It sounds again as though the scenes, the balance of power is being played out here between the parliament and the politicians being opposed by the Supreme Court, the army there with its factor in being involved, waiting in the wings and so on. It is a 3- or 4-way balance as ever, isn't it, really?
David, thank you so much for that typically generous introduction of yours. Yes, it is a nasty struggle taking place between the sources of authority in Pakistan. You have the civilian government, you have the army, and you have the judiciary. And the outcome is more or less certain because the army has the guns and the soldiers. However, the people of Pakistan, David, right now are caught in a dilemma. They are not particularly enamored of the civilian government. Many see it as corrupt and incompetent. At the same time, they really don't want another bout of martial law. Memories of President Musharraf's martial law are still fresh in people's minds.
Do you think, in fact, Mr. Gilani is right and that the president has immunity under the law?
Perhaps there's something in the Constitution which protects him, but certainly not in the public eye. In the public eye, David, there is a widespread perception that he is not a particularly honest man. If you recall, in the former government of his wife, Prime Minister Bhutto, he was called Mr. 10%. So he did not enjoy a great reputation for integrity. And what's happened over the last couple of years has not enhanced his reputation. And of course, combined with the real problems Pakistan faces, internally and externally, he's not been able to live up to the challenges that face the country.
And what about former President Musharraf? We have a situation there where he says he's now back in London preparing himself for returning to Pakistan to go for power in a democratic way, going back to power. Is that a practical hope? I mean, is there anything that shows that there's a large body of opinion that will support him?
Well, David, you know from your own history that all military dictators sitting on Helena or St. Helena or Elba are actually waiting to be called back to their native land. And it never quite works out that way. Similarly, in Pakistan, once the military commander, the general, the commander-in-chief leaves the army, his power base is effectively removed. So President Musharraf, while he has some support in certain quarters in Pakistan, undoubtedly, by and large, the people of Pakistan will not welcome him, number one. And number two, he risks serious arrest, perhaps assassination attempts, and I'm not sure how successful his return will be. And that is why he's postponed his return, which was supposed to be at the end of this month. He simply postponed it indefinitely.
And the person whose position has changed dramatically since you and I last spoke is, we talked to him just recently, a riveting interview with Imran Khan, who with those two mega rallies has really, partially by dramatising the anti-corruption part of his policies, but he really has become a real figure of some potential power now in Pakistan, hasn't he?
He has, David, and it's interesting because there's a correlation between his sudden, as you say, emergence as the super figure, almost titanic figure on the political horizon, and yet completely untested in the polls. Because over the last few years, his party has not done very well in the elections and struggled just to survive. Now, can he convert this popularity? And there's no doubting his charisma and the fact that he's touching a vast number of Pakistanis, not just the young, not just the sports fans. He symbolizes integrity. He's a new face, untested. And the people of Pakistan are so tired of the two main parties of Pakistan that they're saying, well, let's give this guy a chance. Now, against that, you have the very feudal and tribal politics of Pakistan. You have the military establishment. And within that, you have these enormous problems internally in Balochistan, in the tribal areas, on the frontiers, the relationship with the United States. So even if Imran does come in, he faces monumental challenges once in office.
It's supposed to be elections next year. Could they be brought forward? Is that within the power of the current government, for instance, to change the date of the election?
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question because there seems to be a kind of either a martial law, a military coup, or the dismissal of the government. Now, a compromise could be exactly what you're saying, which is early elections, possibly resulting in a completely changed political landscape, and then allowing new faces like Imran Khan to emerge and hopefully tackle the enormous problems that Pakistan faces.
Do you think that there's a possibility that the army will seize power or that they will do all they can not to?
I think, David, in the past, you know, we've seen the army taking power 3 or 4 times in Pakistan, and they take power quite strongly, clearly, unambiguously. This time, there's a lot of hesitation, both within the army and outside in the Pakistan public. So my feeling is that they will be very, very careful and cautious about actually jumping in and taking power because, David, ultimately, martial law does not solve any problems. We are back to square one and we have to restart the whole cycle of democracy and then slowly, you know, really clinging our way back to the path which must lead ultimately to a modern, democratic, clean, well-run state, which needs to be what Pakistan is. And in the vision of the founder of Pakistan, Mr. Jinnah, that's exactly what he envisaged in his mind, not this half-functioning state that we have today in Pakistan.
Thank you so much again, as ever, Akbar. It's a joy to hear from you. Thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, Sir David.
Few people are better qualified to talk about wars and the nature of warfare than my next guest, the official historian of the Falklands War and a renowned professor of war studies at King's College in London. Lawrence Freedman was also a foreign policy advisor to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. 5 years after the death of Saddam Hussein, bombs continue to cause havoc in Baghdad. So in this 21st century, is the world any safer than it was in the 20th? Professor Freedman is here right now. Professor, you're perhaps the world's greatest expert on the subject of war. Not exactly an enviable title, but anyway, in the best sense of the word. Now, how much has this subject changed in the last few years? I mean, is war, as we contemplate it around the world and so on, more dangerous, safer in a strange sort of way?
War is always dangerous, and we always have to remember that though we don't think of it so much anymore, nuclear weapons are still around, and actually a lot of the crises that we see around the world have got some nuclear weapons connection to them, whether it's Iran or North Korea and so on. And while they're around, even if you're talking about not very many explosions, that's extraordinarily dangerous. If you turn your head away from the nuclear dimension, I think most views would be it's actually become less dangerous. Historical trends show fewer wars, less casualties than in the past. Now, it's always dangerous to rely on trends because it doesn't take many events to turn them around. But overall, this is a period when there are fewer big wars than there have been in the past.
Does an event like Libya suggest that, in fact, in terms of war or small war or aggression or whatever, can be effective and could be effective in Syria? Or well, is that a completely different scenario?
I think Libya is interesting because it actually goes back to a pre-Iraq model, if you like. You could compare it with Kosovo in 1999. And what happened in both of these cases is NATO intervenes, but it doesn't try to control events on the ground. And that has a cost in the sense that whatever's going on the ground may not always be to its liking, even if the side that it's notionally supporting wins. But at the same time, it's not implicated in the way that it was implicated in Iraq and Afghanistan in the governance of the country. The Syrian case, you don't have the same clarity about the battle lines as you do with Libya. You don't have the regime probably is now almost as unpopular as Gaddafi. Gaddafi had managed to offend almost every leader in the Arab world, so there was nobody supporting him. And I think the role of the Arab League in these events is becoming really quite interesting because they're becoming much more of a radical force than one would ever have imagined in the past. So the fact that they're starting to talk much more actively may create a situation where there is intervention, but you're talking about a much more challenging situation, the relationship with Lebanon next door, not to mention, of course, the potential complications with Israel. So that's why I think you're seeing much more hesitation about Syria than we saw with Libya.
And then also there's is it possible for Iran to be taken on if it's decided that it ought to be, which it hasn't been at the moment, but could the West or the West and the Middle East together or whatever take on Iran effectively?
It depends what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
I think if you're talking about the two major issues that have been raised, one, taking out Iran's nuclear capability, it's not easy. I mean, you could do it, but it requires quite regular attacks. People have got in mind what happened with Iraq in 1981 when the Israelis had they did it with Syria as well, had one strike and it's out, but this wouldn't be like that. The Iranian sites are much better protected, they've got air defences, they're moving them underground. It wouldn't be easy. So they could certainly delay the Iranian programme, but it'd be unwise to assume that you could just take it out like that, however much people might want to. Taking on the country as a whole, if you like, regime change in Iran, I think would be a pretty horrendous thing to try. And you know, you've got a country that's got lots of internal divisions and tensions at the moment. I think that there's a lot to play for with Iran. It's a much more complex and diverse political system than we sometimes give it credit for. So I don't myself see any appetite at all for a conflict of that sort. But people are very nervous about the implications of an Iranian nuclear weapon. And so one can't rule out that people wouldn't try to at least put it back if it looked like getting close. But I just don't think anybody should underestimate the difficulty.
As you look at the world today, do you find it a less frightening place or a more frightening place?
You know, if you spend all your time worrying about war, your instinct is always to look for the dark side, because I think it's part of almost the responsibility to sort of worry about things that can go wrong without sort of being totally paranoid about it. I think that in many ways, I think, you know, the situation's far better than my father or my grandfather lived through. Far less dangerous and far less likely to involve us in sort of the global confrontations that we saw. But you know, we're coming possibly to the end of a good period, and a lot of the economic crises that are going on, the upheavals potentially in Europe, but certainly in the Arab world and elsewhere, the changing power configurations indicate there's a degree of instability around at the moment that could produce some unexpected and pretty adverse consequences. So I think the job is not to sort of look forward and say, no, it's all fine, or look forward and say, no, it's terribly dangerous, but to be alert to a series of quite dangerous possibilities that, so long as we're alert, hopefully international statesmen and women are able to deal with them.
Professor, thank you very much indeed. The world today is a different place even to the world of last year. We've seen mass protests, uprisings and revolts on an unprecedented scale. The Occupy Wall Street movement galvanized thousands of people, young people and others, into putting down their lattes and taking to the streets. Laurie Penny, author, journalist and activist, has been part of this sea change, documenting the new movement for the New Statesman on the one hand, and on her blog, Penny Red, as well. She joins us now here in the studio to explain why she thinks the world is changing the way it is changing right now. Welcome, Laurie. It's great to have you with us. Now, which do you feel you are first? Are you first of all an activist and second a journalist, or vice versa?
It's a really difficult question, and I didn't ever think I'd get to the point where I'd have to choose. Yeah. But I think for me over the last year, it's been more useful to. I think it's been more useful to activism for me to play the role of journalist, which means that there are some things you have to step back from, and it changes the relationship between your work and your politics, obviously. But I think I would say I'm a journalist first, and that changes the nature of your activism. But that doesn't mean you're not allowed to have politics. Right. And what, in the sense of that, what are your politics? They're not party politics, are they? Wider than that, or what? No, I think, like a lot of young people today, and not just young people, party politics seem increasingly irrelevant to what you actually feel needs to change in the world. Somebody said to me last week they're looking forward in Britain to the next Labour, Lib Dem, Tory coalition. The sense, whether or not that's accurate, particularly amongst young people in the Occupy movements and in other movements, is that party politics offers us very few genuine alternatives, that there's a crisis of representative democracy. across the developed and developing world, and that's what's happening in Europe. That's what's happening in America. You see with the elections that are happening at the moment, a lot of young people really couldn't care less. There was this idea that with Obama there'd be great change and there'd be a real alternative for the first time, and that's and the same thing in Britain with the Liberal Democrats. There was a real kind of hunger to believe that representative democracy could offer us something different, an alternative to neoliberalism. But we've seen over the last couple of years, we've been terribly disappointed by that idea, and now people are just very uninterested in party politics, and you can see why. You can see why.
Yeah, and do young people today, do you think, do they still feel that protests and uprisings are valuable and can really have an effect, or that they fade away and don't?
Well, all protests fade away, and protests change. That's the nature of resistance. It's the nature of direct action. But just because things change doesn't mean things don't have an effect. What protest is most useful for, I think, well, not the only thing it's useful for, but one of the most important things about resistance is the way it changes the nature of debate and changes the ideas that take place at the heart of party politics as well as street politics. So now you see in the UK David Cameron talking about responsible capitalism and changing capitalism, using the word capitalism, which isn't something that you would have seen a couple of years ago, having to justify capitalism. And Obama speaking the language, using the words 99%, these might seem like little things, but it's changing the whole mentality of how politics and how economics are understood. And you can laugh at young people sitting in tents on the streets and call them crazy hippies, but they're changing the way people are thinking about politics fundamentally, and it's great to see that happening.
So they really are effective in that sense. The protests, the uprisings are really changing things.
I think they're definitely changing things, and maybe obviously we've seen the Occupy movement get evicted. I was there when they got evicted in New York. It was very, very sad. I saw bulldozers kind of taking away tents and people loading tents and books into the back of dump trucks, and it was really and the brutality with which the evictions have happened. Now Occupy London, which is one of the last remaining big protests in the Occupy movement in the world, has received notice that it's going to be evicted. That doesn't mean that the effect of these protests won't be long-lasting. I think it signals a real change in how young people understand politics. Young people particularly are sick of playing the game, sick of waiting and filling out forms and calling people and canvassing and hoping that somewhere down the line a small change will happen. People are seeing that there's much more urgency here. There's much, we have 5 years before catastrophic climate change is an inevitability. We don't have time to wait. We don't have time to wait for gradual change anymore, and that's why people are taking to the streets.
Thanks ever so much for being with us today.
It's been wonderful to be here.
It's been great fun, hasn't it? Been great fun. Yeah. In a minute, French movies, the Arab Spring and Greece. That's at least 3 of the topics after this short break.